Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about structuring a social sciences or STEM article. So typically what this structure that I'm going to talk through is an APA structure, American Psychological Association. They are really the big organization that sets citation standards and organization standards used by most disciplines in the social sciences and a lot of disciplines in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This is essentially a structure for an argument or a structure for an article meant to present research findings. And in this case, by research, I mean things like experimental studies, interview-based studies, survey-based studies, observation-based studies, things like this, the kind of work that you would do in the social sciences or some of the STEM disciplines. Now, these articles have a very specific set of components, and we're going to talk about those components and why each of them is important. So I break this down into about 9.5 pieces. Not everybody necessarily breaks it down this way. Some people break it down more to like 6 or 7 distinct pieces, but I break it down to about 9.5. I'm going to put up a list of them on the screen so that you can sort of see these, and then I'll talk through each of these components to explain why they're important, what they do, and why they matter. So the first thing that you encounter with an article like this is the title. Then the name of the author or authors. Generally with the social sciences and STEMs, you tend to get multi-authored papers, so it's often the names of the authors plural. Next you get the abstract, which is a condensed version of the overall argument. Then you get the introduction, which tends to establish the topic of the research and often gives the hypothesis being tested. Next, you get a literature review, and this is a sort of survey of the field, what information other people have come up with. Next, you have a methodology section, which talks about how the data for this particular research was gathered. You have a findings or results section, which talks about what data has actually been found in this study. What it gives us the information that the researchers have come up with. You have a discussion section, which explains what the significance of the findings are in terms of the hypothesis or answering the research question. You have a conclusion, which wraps up the article and often will point to directions for future research. And then you have a references list. Works cited, bibliography, whatever it is, but in APA, we call it a references list. And that's the citations for all of the sources. So that's your basic structure. As you move through most social sciences or STEM articles, you will get things in that order. Sometimes things will be combined, like there are definitely articles that have the introduction and the literature review in one continuous section, but you can usually identify them as distinct components, even if they're in the same section without a section break. So let's talk a little bit more about each of these elements, what they are and why they're significant to the rhetoric of social sciences or STEM writing. So starting with the title. The title is the first impression that a reader gets of the article. And as we all know from any job interview advice we've ever gotten, first impressions are the most important. Part of the reason in this case that first impressions are most important, part of the reason that the title is so significant is because it needs to grab the reader's interest and tell the reader what this article is about. If you are doing research, let's say you've gone to a university library database and you've put your search terms in, and you've got a list of 750 potential sources that the database thinks might be useful to you. Well, you're scrolling through them. The main thing that you are looking at is article titles. So that title needs to get your attention and needs to tell you what the argument itself is about, because that's how you get people to read your work. Second, the name of the author or authors. This is one you don't have that much control over, but it's also a really significant component of an article like this because it can help establish the credibility of the source, the ethos of the source in rhetorical terms. If you are an author, or if you have an author in your group who has a good amount of name recognition, or who has a prominent position or something like that in the field, that person's name will create what's called situated ethos. That is, ethos that authors have before the reader even starts reading the essay. So that's really important, even if you can't do much about it necessarily. The abstract is then the next thing that we get, and this is super important for readers, for people who are doing their own research, because an abstract is a generally about 75 to 150 word synopsis of the overall argument being made in this article. It condenses the information so that readers can relatively quickly and easily determine whether or not this article is going to be useful for them and whether or not this looks like a reliable study. So typically the things an abstract wants to cover: the hypothesis or research question being pursued. That's a very important component in terms of letting people know what this study is actually about. A brief summary of methodology. So how did you gather your data? And a brief summary of results or conclusions. What does this data tell us? What do we get out of this experiment and out of reading this study? So that's what you're looking for with an abstract, because that's the kinds of things that readers are going to be, those are the questions that readers are going to be asking to figure out whether or not this is something they want to take the time to read. Next, the introduction to the article. The introduction generally does a couple of major things, one of which is to introduce the topic itself, along with, more specifically, the research question or the hypothesis that's being examined. So what is this study about? What are you trying to figure out? And the other big thing the introduction will typically do is start setting the stakes for this work. Why does this research matter? What problems does it solve? What questions does it answer? Why do we need this study? These kinds of questions. These are things that get covered in the introduction. Then you have a literature review. And this is a kind of state of the field thing where you look at as many other sources as you could find where people have written about this topic. This is one of the ways in which you establish your credibility as an author, because it shows that you are aware of the work that other people have done. But it allows you to establish connections and gaps in the existing research. And that's one of the big things in research, whether this is social sciences or STEM. What questions do we not yet have answers to? Or what data is not as reliable as it could be, or these sorts of things. And a literature review helps you establish that, because you can show connections between different articles, different books, different studies, etc., etc. But you can also say, while people have established answers to these questions, we've got this set of questions that are still unanswered. We need more data about these things. So that's what you want to do in the lit review, basically. Your methodology section is going to cover a couple of major things. One being, what techniques did you actually use to gather data? So if you're doing surveys, you talk about how you did surveys, what population you surveyed, what your unit of analysis is, that is how many people took your survey. If you're doing observation, you talk about your observational method. What did you do to actually look at the subjects that you are writing about without influencing them, etc., etc. So how did you gather data? You also, in your methodology section, want to talk about how you analyzed this data. So if you had to do statistical analysis, what sorts of statistical analysis did you do? And I don't know from statistics because I took the dumbest, easiest math class I possibly could in university, but there's a lot of different ways to analyze statistics in order to understand them in different ways. You want to establish what methods you used to analyze your data to find meaning. And the reason you want to make sure that you talk about how you're analyzing your data is because that shows readers how reliable your conclusions are going to be. If you've used a reliable, recognized method for analyzing your data, that means it's probably going to, that your conclusions are probably going to be more reliable. Next, the findings or results section. Basically, this is fairly straightforward. You say, this is our data. This is what we have gathered, what we have found through our research, through the methodology that we have used. And you may start breaking things down. You may, if you're doing like statistical analysis of your data or something like that, you may break down what some of these statistics are, whatever it is. So basically, this is analysis and explanation of the data and what the data tells us. That generally leads pretty clearly and directly into the discussion section. And the discussion section is an explanation of what the data means in terms of answering your research question or testing your hypothesis. So, does this data prove your hypothesis? Does it disprove your hypothesis? Does it answer the research question? Or is there, for some reason, not enough data? Was the research methodology not sufficient to provide reliable information? And that does happen. Like there are published articles out there where the conclusion is we still don't have enough data for whatever reason. Either the experimental methodology was not reliable, or it didn't produce testable results. There was a variable we didn't or couldn't account for, whatever it happens to be. That's definitely a thing that real researchers run into. So that's what the discussion section is all about. What does your data mean? What kinds of conclusions can you draw about the information that you have, and whether or not that sort of fulfills your subject, whether or not that fulfills your hypothesis or your research question. Then the conclusion. This is usually a fairly short bit at the end of the paper itself. Basically, the conclusion, again, is going to wrap everything up. You may actually return to some of the stuff you talked about in the introduction to the paper and just sort of reiterate the stakes of the project, what you were trying to accomplish, reiterate what the conclusions were, or the results were, not results, the discussion was, etc., etc. But then the other thing that conclusions often do in social sciences or STEM papers is point to potential corridors for future research. So that may be things like, while our study answered X question, Y, Z, A questions still exist. we did not gather data either because we didn't get enough information or because we weren't testing for these things. So we did not answer these questions that should be answered in the future. Or it can be, in some way, our experiment, our study was insufficient. Here's why it was insufficient, and here's what could be done for future study in order to correct these problems. So those are a couple of different approaches you can take to point future researchers in useful directions, in terms of saying, here's what can be done productively to carry this work forward. And then the final section of a research paper is going to be the references section. This is the citations to the sources that you have cited or consulted. And this does a couple of important things. One, it protects you from plagiarism charges, because if you are citing your sources and you are doing that ethically and responsibly, obviously you are giving credit where credit is due, and that's exactly what you want to be doing. Second, this is going to benefit other researchers because it tells them where you've gotten your information. And so if they are interested in learning more about this topic, they can follow up from your citations. And third, this is going to build your credibility. The Lit Review does the same kind of work here, but the references helps build your credibility, your ethos, both by situating you as someone who is knowledgeable about the larger conversation on this subject, but also by showing that you know disciplinary conventions. Because citations are a standard part of academic research, being able to do them will help build your credibility, because that's what's expected from a professional researcher and a professional writer in these disciplines. So that's your general structure that you're going to follow. And again, if you look at most social sciences or STEM articles reporting on the results of research or experiments, you will see this structure.